us start reading. We are in that fantastic passage where Srimni is describing how time is flexible. It is not something fixed at all. It depends on which level of consciousness you are, and time takes on either slow or fast, or it, it is very, very variable depending on where you are. In the physical world, we have a sequence, okay? It goes. And there is the in the self, there is no time for you. There is time for the body, mind, life, but the consciousness and the soul, which is in the self, there is no time and space for you there. It becomes the power of now, according to Eckhart Tolle. Eckhart Tolle is a German and who had the experience of self. He goes all over the world preaching uh, his, his principle of going to the self. Again, becoming calm and quiet. So now this is what he is saying. So we will read the, so depending on which level you are, you experience time in that way. So I think we have to now read. If we go behind time, you'll have to confirm. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. That is where we have to start reading.
Okay. So let's read that para. If we go behind time by a similar inward motion. So about a page. So who will read?
Geetanjali Di, can you read? Because it is.
We'll read the next paragraph, please.
Okay. So Yasmin maybe can read.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
We go
I'll
behind.
read.
Yeah.
If we go behind time by a similar inward motion, drawing back from the physical and seeing it without being involved in it, we discover that time observation and time movement are relative. But time itself is real and eternal. Time observation depends not only on the measures used, but on the consciousness and position of the observer. Moreover, each state of consciousness has a different time relation. Time in mind, consciousness, and mind space has not the same sense and measure of its movement as in physical space. It moves there quickly or slowly according to the state of the consciousness. Each state of consciousness has its own time, and yet there can be relations of time between them. And when we go behind the physical surface, we find several different time statuses and time movements coexistent in the same consciousness. This is evident in dream time, where a long sequence of happenings can occur in a period which corresponds to a second or a few seconds of physical time. There is then a certain relation between different time statuses, but no ascertainable correspondence of measure. It would seem as if time had no objective reality, but depends on whatever the condition may be established by action of consciousness in its relation to status and motion of being. Time would seem to be purely subjective, but in fact, space also would appear by the mutual relation of mind space and matter space to be subjective. In other words, both are the original spiritual extensions, but it is rendered by mind in its purity into a subjective mind field and by sense mind into an objective field of same perception. Subjectivity and objectivity are only two sides of one consciousness, and the cardinal fact is that any given time or space, or any given time space as a whole, is a status of being in which there is a movement of the consciousness and force of the being, a movement that creates or manifests events and happenings. It is the relation of the consciousness that sees and the force that formulates the happening, a relation inherent in the status which determines the sense of time and creates our awareness of time movement time relation, time measure. In its fundamental truth, the original status of time being its variation is nothing else than the eternity of the eternal, just as the fundamental truth of space, the original sense of its reality, is the infinity of the infinite.
Okay, a very interesting para, and he is very, very clearly he is saying, but to understand the clarity, we'll have to go behind the words and he's saying, make it absolutely uh, concrete to ourselves. So let us go back to the beginning of it. So he's saying, if we go behind time by similar inward motion, so what is that inward motion? Normally, our consciousness is stuck to the in the physical world. We are aware of what is happening in the physical world, but not so much within ourselves. So you have to inward motion means you lose consciousness of the physical world and you go into yourself, and the inner consciousness becomes more real than the outside world. In fact, you can keep your eyes closed or you can keep your eyes open. But in the beginning, we have to keep our eyes closed if we want to shut out the world and go into ourselves. That's why meditation is very necessary. You keep your eyes closed. But once you are a yogi and you have attained the inner consciousness, the inward inner being, then you can keep your eyes open. Like Mother and Sri Aurobindo are talking to you, yet their consciousness is above and inside and not on the surface. Okay? So this is what I mean by inward motion. Drawing back from the physical and seeing it without being involved in it. You are not involved in the physical action of your body, mind, life, but you are only seeing it. The description is very clear. If you are seeing it, you are in the witness consciousness. So this is what he's saying. It's clearly seeing it without being involved in it is the self. Okay? The experience of Brahman. We discover, what do we discover when we go to the self? We discover that time observation and time movement are relative, but time itself is real and eternal. Now he's making a difference between time observation and time movement. The time observation is what you are observing. In other words, it is your subjective. It's a subjective capacity. You are watching the thing happening in the physical world, but there is time, whether you exist or not, the time movement is there in the physical world. So that's the time movement, independent of you. But when you are watching it, each one is watching, and the time observation depends upon the individual. Each individual is observing time, the passage of something happening, an event, and each one is observing in a different way. Note interestingly also that when there are 10 people watching a particular scene, each one will be seeing something else. Not only in time, but they will see, and each one will be seeing in a different way. Okay, so time observation pertaining to the individual, and it is subjective. Time movement, something not individualized but universal. So a relative. Everything is relative, nothing fixed. Okay. And we experience that. But time itself is real and eternal. That's what you see when you go to the self. Now, time observation depends not only on the measures used. What are the measures used? You can use your clocks, and you can use your the shadow of the sun. Okay, on in fact in the old days the measures used the shadow of the sun. Okay? When that is a measure of the, and now we have electronic clocks. Okay? So the measure is very clearly the instrument by which you are measuring time. Very clearly the wristwatch that we wear on our on our hand. Okay, so that's a measure. It doesn't depend only on that, but on the consciousness and the position of the observer. Where is the observer stationed? Is he in the physical world? Is he in the vital world? Is he in the mental world? Not you. You are always in the physical world, but your consciousness, where is it? Okay, but very easy to understand this, because if you are sleeping at night, you are in the your body is in the physical world, but where is your consciousness? It's not in the physical world. It has gone out somewhere. It has gone into the vital world or the inner world, or into the mental world or even higher up. In fact, Mother says the real sleep is only for about 10 minutes when it goes to the highest level. So obviously your consciousness depends on, so when he says position of the observer, it's a consciousness that observes. Okay? So that can depend on. Moreover, each state of consciousness has a different time relation. Note that carefully, as a different time relation. In other words, the time can be seen, suppose you are at the higher mind level or the over mind level or the intuitive mind level. There is, time will be different at each level, but there is also a connection. If there were no connection, okay, let us say Srendo is in the over mind consciousness, but he is working in the physical world. He is sending messages to people, he is curing people, he is determining events in the physical world by in the war. Okay, the famous example of Dunkirk is there, where he brought a huge amount of clouds. Suddenly, fog came in the English Channel, and all the 300,000 Allied troops were able to escape, and Germany could do nothing about it. So this is what he is doing all the time. He also mentioned the two other cases: the American soldier John Kelly, and also the Romanian freedom fighter Silviu Rasionas. Okay, so Sremda is doing and working in the physical world. That's why there is a relation. Although you are in the higher plane, you are not stuck there hermetically sealed from the other consciousnesses. Okay? You are there everywhere. And that is interesting because Ramakrishna has a word for that. He says Ishvara Koti and Jiva Koti. Jiva Koti is a soul which is fixed on one plane of consciousness. But the Ishvara Koti is one who can range fully. Wherever he wants to go, he can go in that whole range of consciousness, right from the superconscious to the lowest consciousness. Remember Mother's experience of going into the inconscient. She can do that. We can't go to the inconscient, but she could do that. She could go right into the inconscient. So that's the power of the yoga. You can range yourself in the entire range of, you can move in the entire range of existence right from the top to the bottom. Okay. Then position of the observer. Moreover, each state of consciousness has a different time relation. He is not stopping at different time. He is going to relation. That means at every level you are, the relation with the other worlds and times changes. Now he is giving an example. Time in mind consciousness and mind space has not the same sense and measure of its movements in the physical space. Note the word measure, and that you can immediately apply the concept of in the Bermuda Triangle. When that plane goes into the, suddenly it loses contact and goes into a subtler world, it is no more visible on the radar screen. So if it is visible on the radar screen, it should be in the physical world. But because it has gone out of the radar screen, it has gone into a place where the radar can't detect it. It's gone into the vital world, okay? One above the physical. And then when it goes there, naturally time has changed. And that's why when the plane comes back into the other physical world again, yes, saved. The plane has saved time. You notice fantastically that you have come 15 minutes before your scheduled time. How 15 minutes earlier? Because you have gone into a place where time is less. So there is an interchangeability between all these planes of consciousness where time goes on changing. Very clear. At time and he is still using the not only the same sense but measure. Okay, so we measure time by our clocks, and even that gets affected. That's the reason. It moves there quickly or slowly according to the state of the consciousness, depending at which level. Each state of consciousness has its own time, and yet there can be relations of time between them. That's exactly what we discussed just now. Suppose there were no connections, then you would not be able to work on two different planes at the same time. A yogi's powers will be limited only to that plane of consciousness. But it is not like that. He can work in the physical world, he can work even at the higher worlds, he can go very wanton. And when we go behind the physical surface, we find several different time statuses and time movements. So there can be a time status, that means no time at all. And there also he's saying it's different. The time status in the higher mind is one, the time status in the element mind is one, the time status in overmind is another. It's not the same. And time movements. Time movements also go on changing. When you are in the higher levels of consciousness and you watch the physical world, you see different time movements coexist in the same consciousness. In fact, this explains the Trikala Drishti also. When you are there, you can see the past, present, and future. And he's saying the relativity of time. This is evident in dream time, where a long sequence of happenings can occur in a period which may be a second or a few seconds of physical time. Now, I don't know if any of you have experienced this, because for that, you have to look at your clock and then go to sleep and get up again to within 2 seconds and see the dream that you have had. It's a half an hour dream seen in 2-3 seconds. But I think in the physical world it's very difficult to see that, because you can't wake up and go to sleep in 2 seconds and come back again. So this is possible only at the, I'm mentioning it because it's possible only when you are a yogi. You can see that in 2 seconds or 3 seconds, you can have a long sequence of dream. There is then certain relation between different time statuses, but no ascertainable correspondence of measure. You can't say how many seconds or how many minutes or how many hours. You can't. That's what it means by measure. The measure is always a physical measure. It would seem as if time had no objective reality. Because if it had an objective reality, it would be very, very clear and static. But if it is going on changing, then it's not objective, it's subjective. It depends on whatever by action of consciousness in its relation to status and motion of being. Motion of being is in the physical world only. In the other planes of consciousness, motion is not there. In the spiritual planes of consciousness, there is no motion. That's why it is immutable. When you make your mind silent, it becomes, the consciousness becomes immutable, lodged in the mind complex, established by action of consciousness in relation to status and motion. Time would seem to be purely subjective. But in fact, space also would appear by the mutual relation of mind space and matter space to be subjective. When we think of space, when we have a thought, you can have a thought of you going from one place to another place. So that's in mind, you have there is space when you're thinking of. So that is also, there's a mind space and matter space to be subjective. In other words, both are the original spiritual extension. He's saying at the highest level, matter, time, and space are all one. See? But when it comes down, it breaks in different time statuses and different time motions. That's what he's saying. At the highest level, as it keeps coming down, the one becomes the many. So time becomes many statuses of time. Okay, slow, slower, slowest, or fast, faster, fastest. Both are original spiritual extension. Note the word extension, because there can be a condition where there is no extension. It's absolutely concentrated into one. That's the dhyana, what they call. There is no movement at all. It is concentrated into one. But when it extends itself, it can be in time and space, but it need not be in time and space also. The triple status of supermind is that it is an extension, but not in time and space. You can feel yourself to be infinite. Both are original, but it is rendered by mind in its purity into a subjective mind field and a mind sense into an objective field of sense perception. Subjectivity and objectivity are only two sides of one consciousness. And the cardinal fact is that any given time or space or any given time space as a whole is a status of being in which there is movement of the consciousness and force of being, a movement that creates or manifests events or happenings. We'll stop here. He's saying subject and object are the same. Where is that? At the highest level. Because if you are the divine, you are the only thing that exists. So when you are creating, as the divine, when you are creating within yourself. So that's the funny part, that when you are creating within yourself, okay, if you remember those chapters, you have to see very carefully. Consciousness separates itself from force and starts looking at its own force. There is a condition. If one where force and consciousness are together, therefore there cannot be any look. The consciousness cannot look at itself. It is one. It is absolutely conscious of itself as only one. But when consciousness starts looking at force as something separate from itself, but the separateness is within itself. So there is subject and object is one. Then that subject and object separate, even in the supermind consciousness is separate. And when it comes further down, they become absolutely separate. The physical world is absolutely objective to us, and we are subjective to ourselves. But what happens when you go to the self? You get the cosmic consciousness. The whole universe is within you. That which is objective becomes now subjective because it is within you. It's a very relative thing. Okay? So this is what we have to pick up from. It is the relation of the consciousness that sees and the force that formulates the happenings, a relation inherent in the status, which determines the sense of time and creates awareness of time movement, time relation, time measure. Now, time movement, time relation, and time measure. The words he's using, certainly he's not using them meaninglessly. Time movement, the objective time movement, which is different at different levels, but still it is time movement. He has told you that time is real and not necessarily subjective. Time observation is subjective, but time movement is objective. And there is also a relation between the different times. So that's a relation. Then there's a time measure. Okay, in seconds or hours or whatever, you can measure it.
What happened?
Tell me. You're asking a question?
Tanu, we have to do web checking.
Huh? I can't hear you. I thought someone asked a question.
No, I think Yasmin's phone is on.
Okay. So, I'm reading the last sentence. In its fundamental truth, the original status of time behind all its variations is nothing else than the eternity of the eternal. Just as the fundamental truth of space, the original sense of its reality is the infinity of the infinite. This is very clearly the supramental level. Fundamentally, everything is static. From that static condition, time comes out into movements which are not one fixed thing, but different time levels. In fact, if you apply the principle of the one becoming the many, it can be applicable even to time and space. One time becomes the many times in the physical world. Not only in the physical world, but in the spiritual world also. That's what he's saying. Space also can go on different. So this is something very not easy to understand, but there are these extremely interesting experiences in the physical world where you see that, yes, there is a lot of truth, although we may not understand clearly, but that's why I sent you that very fantastic experience of this lady who, if you have not read it yet, please read it and try to understand it by the principles we have discussed. The first is you can be at various levels of consciousness at the same time. And there's a relation between them. You can station yourself in the higher level of consciousness, yet continue to do in the physical world things, and they will have an effect. That's not very easy to understand, because if you want to wash clothes, you need your body. But if you think a little carefully, you will see that it's not the body which is doing the washing of the clothes, but the force. And the force is the life force. So it is, you can wash the clothes with life force without your body. Just think about it. What about the phenomena of ghosts? They are only force, and they are in the world, and they are having effects in the physical world without a body. So that is possible. So if you think of it that way, then that experience of that lady who is sleeping and prays to God that, oh my God, there is so much trouble and I am sick, and why don't you help me? And she goes to sleep. And when she wakes up, she sees that the kitchen is clean, the clothes are washed and ironed, and everything is ready in the physical world. So if you keep this in mind, all these different things, and collect them together, it is possible to understand what she's saying. And she herself is surprised. She doesn't know what's happening. I have always been wondering about the time. What is time actually? Okay. So now we can go to the next one. Very interesting. I strongly recommend all of you to think about this time and keep all the principles that we have discussed. Then you will understand even the most incredible things.
Okay,
Okay.
shall
Can
I?
I ask a question?
Pardon?
Can I ask a question, please?
Yes, please
You
go ahead.
I'm just wondering why on the physical earth we have the Bermuda Triangle. Are there more spaces on earth which are like Bermuda Triangle?
That's interesting. That is a question which I can't answer. Why it happens only in that geographical location, that I can't answer. But it is true that it happens only there. But I read somewhere that if you draw through the center of the earth, if you go, okay, it goes to the other side of the globe, and there also the same thing happens. Okay, but maybe it is somewhere in the sea between the Russian and the Japanese, somewhere there in the sea. So it is much rarer, and it is not it is not reported often. So it could have something to do with the electronic, or no, what is that called? Electromagnetic forces. It could have something to do with that. Even that does not explain why it should happen only in that place, but there is something to do, because electronic force is electromagnetic force is after all prana. So prana is the vital word. So it could have something to do with that. But that mystery has yet to be solved. Most human beings find that an impossible mystery, but it is a fact. That's what is happening all the time. But why it should happen only in that place is difficult to answer. Okay, as I told you, I read only once somewhere that if you draw a line from the Bermuda Triangle, which goes right through the center of the earth, it emerges on the other side of the globe, diametrically opposite, and it is somewhere in above Japan and above the Siberian, that Bering Strait is there, somewhere there, and it is so cold, maybe there aren't enough cases to report. And even if there are cases, it is so rare that we don't get it's not well known. Maybe there are cases.
No, how
Okay.
can it be? Because Bermuda Triangle is closer to the equator. But what you are telling us is high up north at that Kamchatka Peninsula of Russia. So if you draw a diagonal line then it can't
Okay.
go from Bermuda Triangle towards Japan. It has to
Yeah,
go
okay.
through and through Earth on the other side.
Okay. Now we have to see very carefully if the Bermuda Triangle is on the equator. Is that true? Or
No,
is it
it is
slightly above?
closer to the equator, means, it's in the tropics.
No, that I know. That I know.
Ah.
Yeah, what I said. Yeah, what I said is not very correct. So it is not so high up. It is nearer to the equator, but in the Pacific Ocean somewhere. In the Pacific Ocean, because there is the Atlantic Ocean, and when you draw that line, as I told you, I read once. It may not even be accurate. Okay, I just remember once.
I'll
it
look
would come
up
out.
the globe and tell you. On the globe of the Earth.
Okay,
you
I
will
think
be
it's
able
interesting to see that.
Huh.
But how will you? Yeah,
My
that's right.
brother
You are right.
is a huge
So we can
globe
have it.
of the Earth.
Yeah, you are right. So you need a globe to see. If you have a globe at home, you can see. Okay, it's interesting, but the question itself, yeah, it's difficult to know why it happens only in one place. So, shall we go to the next one? What's the
Yes,
time?
I will read.
Yeah, the being can have 3 different states.
Yeah. Should I complete the whole chapter or just read the last but one paragraph?
We can read the whole thing and then discuss it next time, because then we get a chance to understand the thing on our own. It's
Okay. So
okay.
I'll complete the
Read the
chapter.
whole thing.
The being can have 3 different states of its consciousness with regard to its own eternity. The first is that in which there is the immobile status of the self in its essential existence, self-absorbed or self-conscious, but in either case without development of consciousness in movement or happening. This is what we distinguish as its timeless eternity. The second is its whole consciousness of the successive relations of all things belonging to a destined or an actually proceeding manifestation in which we call past, present, and future stand together as if in a map or settled design, or very much as an artist or painter or architect might hold all the detail of his work viewed as a whole, intended or reviewed in his mind, or arranged in a plan for execution. This is the stable status or simultaneous integrality of time. This seeing of time is not at all part of our normal awareness of events as they happen, though our view of the past, because it is already known and can be regarded in the whole, may put on something of this character. But we know that this consciousness exists because it is possible in an exceptional state to enter into it and see things from the viewpoint of this simultaneity of time vision. The third status is that of a progressive movement of consciousness force and its successive working out of what has been seen by it in the static vision of the eternal. This is the time movement, but it is in one and the same eternity that this triple status exists and the movement takes place. There are not really 2 eternities. One an eternity of status, another an eternity of movement. But there are different statuses or positions taken by consciousness with regard to the one eternity. For it can see the whole time development from outside or from above the movement. It can take a stable position within the movement and see the before and the after in a fixed, determined, or destined succession. Or it can take instead a mobile position in the movement, itself move with it from moment to moment, and see all that has happened receding back into the past and all that has to happen coming towards it from the future. Or else it may concentrate on the moment it occupies and see nothing but what is in that moment and immediately around or behind it. All these positions can be taken by the being of the infinite in a simultaneous vision or experience. It can see time from above and inside time, exceeding it and not within it. It can see the timeless, develop the time movement without ceasing to be timeless. It can embrace the whole movement in a static and a dynamic vision and put out at the same time something of itself into the moment vision. This simultaneity may seem to the finite consciousness tied to the moment vision, a magic of the infinite, a magic of Maya, to its own way of perception which needs to limit, to envisage one status only at a time in order to harmonize it. In order to harmonize, it would give a sense of confused and inconsistent unreality. But to an infinite consciousness, such an integral simultaneity of vision and experience would be perfectly logical and consistent. All could be elements of a whole vision, capable of being closely related together in a harmonious arrangement, a multiplicity of view, bringing out the unity of the thing seen, a diverse presentation of concomitant aspects of the one reality. If there can be this should I finish it?
Go ahead.
If
Go
there
ahead.
can be this simultaneous multiplicity of self-presentation of one reality, we see that there is no impossibility in the coexistence of a timeless eternal and a time eternity. It would be the same eternity viewed by a dual self-awareness, and there could be no opposition between them. It would be a correlation of two powers of the self-awareness of the infinite and eternal reality, a power of status and non-manifestation, a power of self-effecting action and movement and manifestation. Their simultaneity, however contradictory and difficult to reconcile it might seem to our finite surface seeing, would be intrinsic and normal to the Maya or eternal self-knowledge and all knowledge of Brahman, the eternal and infinite knowledge and wisdom power of the Ishvara, the consciousness force of the self-existent Satchidananda.
So, very interesting. Okay. So we'll have a look at this carefully because it's a 1.5 pages, but fascinating. I actually listed out the different experiences of time. I think there are 7 or 8 different possible experiences. We'll discuss that in detail next time. You can be outside time, you can be in time, you can be flowing with the time. All these type of experiences are all very, very possible. So we'll try and understand what it's saying. At least mentally, we'll try and understand what it's saying. But fascinating, and we can't do that in today. So we'll do that next time. Maybe we are stopping a little ahead of time, but perhaps it's because we'll have to see. But the first part we can understand very easily. The 3 statuses, okay, that we will do because we've got 5 minutes at least, 5-6 minutes. So he's saying there are 3 different states of its consciousness with regard to its own eternity. The first is that in which there is an immobile status of the self in its essential existence. So, self-absorbed or self-conscious. But in either case, without development of consciousness in movement or happening. We will stop here. In other words, it's like a black hole. It is conscious only of itself. It has condensed itself, like you compress a file by zip the file into, instead of it's occupying say 100,000 bytes, you compress it and it goes into maybe 100 bytes, okay, exactly as in a computer. That's possible. So you do that with your consciousness. You, in fact, all concentration is exactly that. You remove your diverse, extended, distracted consciousness distributed all over, you collect it into a point and bring it fast, like a magnifying glass also focuses all the sunlight which is distributed onto a single point. So this is the first one. In other words, the divine consciousness is conscious only of itself and nothing else. That's why they call it Chid Ghana. Okay? The consciousness is concentrated and there is no question of any physical world or anything. It is conscious only of itself. Okay? That's with the first one. Look at the words carefully, you will see. The first is that in which there is the immobile status, no movement at all, and it's inward looking. But what is that essential existence? So can there be a non-essential existence? Yes, that's a physical world. It is existence, but non-essential. The essential is a Satchidananda. The physical world is Satchidananda diluted, distributed, diminished. That's not essential. Okay. So that's a word. Self-absorbed or self-conscious. Two different words meaning the same thing. You are conscious only of yourself and you are absorbed into yourself without reference to anything else. So this is the first status. Supermind, maybe even above that. But in either case, without development of consciousness in movement or happening. What does that mean? Development of consciousness and movement and happening is the universe. It develops and extends itself into movement or happening. There is a physical world. But there is no physical world in the first status. This is what we distinguish as the timeless eternity. There is an eternity, you are fully conscious of the eternity, because when you are in the self, you experience the I have always been and I will always be. You have that experience. That's a timeless eternity. Okay? I have always existed. The word used in the Gita is aja, unborn. There is no origin to the soul. And there is no end to the soul either. Because the soul can end itself in a certain way by disappearing into the oversoul, into the divine. But still, it is soul only. So there is no beginning and no end for the soul. That's a timeless eternity. Now the second one is its whole consciousness of the successive relations of all things belonging to a destined or an actually proceeding manifestation, in which what we call past, present, and future stand together as if in a map or a settled design, or very much as an artist or painter or architect might hold all the detail of his work viewed as a whole, intended or reviewed in his mind, or arranged in a plan for execution. This is the stable status or simultaneous integrality of time. This is what he's saying. This is the Trikala Drishti. And the Trikala Drishti is possible not in the level 1, but in level 2. In the spiritual planes of consciousness, you can have Trikala Drishti, but it can be relative in the lower planes like the higher mind and the element mind, but it can be absolute in the overmind and the supermind. So there is a stable simultaneous integrality of time. Simultaneous integral. You are seeing past, present, and future. Trikala Drishti. This seeing of time is not at all part of our normal awareness of events as they happen. So our view of the past, because it's already known and can be regarded as the whole, may put on something of this character. It's very interesting, because when you think of the past, you know what happened 1 year ago, you know what happened 2 years ago, you know what happened 3 years ago. They're all at different times, and yet you see all of them together. So this is something, but the Trikala Drishti includes the present and the future. Our seeing of the past has something of this character, but not the full thing. We don't see the future. When you start seeing the future and the present and the past, it's easy to see the past. Different states of pastness you can see past, but when you see the future, this is Trikala Drishti. I'll tell you.
I have a question.
Yes, yes, tell me.
He is talking of past, but we can only see the past which we were conscious of. But in Trikala Drishti, I think it is also universal, no?
Yes, I think you are right. But there also, Gitanjali, you'll have to focus. You'll have to focus.
Okay.
Suppose I want to know what happened in the American Revolution, I'll have to focus. Okay? So the possibility of knowing anything in the universe is there in the Trikala Drishti, but you'll have to focus. Okay, it's very interesting. I'll just mention one thing to you which I read yesterday, and it really, because now the Kashmir files are really raising a real upheaval in India and all over the world wherever Indians are there, New Zealand, Australia, okay, UK, America, everywhere. They are all going and seeing this movie. But what Sri Aurobindo said, I'm telling you, you can verify. Evening Talks, 1940 June. Okay. Sri Aurobindo is saying, when the Muslims are demanding so many things in Kashmir, if you accede to their demands, the Hindu community will be wiped out. He's saying this in June 1940. And look what happened 50 years later. Completely wiped. He has used the word wiped out. Now that is Trikala Drishti. Also in 1920, when he's seeing that India will be free, the British will walk out by themselves. Okay, so that is Trikala Drishti. Also, I'll give you another example. Our Tara Jawhar has now won the Padma Shri, and all pictures are going everywhere where she is receiving the award from the president. But she told this to us, and I think it was told quite publicly. So mother saw her hand and she kept quiet one day. And Tara was a little surprised and asked her afterwards, why you kept quiet? And she said that I saw something in your past and I will see to it. There was the life was destined to be a little short. Okay? The lifespan was not very extended. But then she is now 85 or 86. No, I think 87 perhaps. 85, 86, 87. And she's still living and she has got even the Padma Shri. Okay. So this is also, mother is not only seeing, but also acting. Now that's exactly what we are. She's changing the destiny, which is fixed in the past. It is destined, but she can change that. This is what Sri is saying, the time relation. You can be stationed in one and have effects on the other planes of consciousness.